Well, now we're going to talk about one of the cultural values that has been the most challenging for me. And in discussing this with my students, I've had several of them say, yeah, this is a tough one. I consider it one of the most difficult to change. Now, I mentioned that collectivism and individualism are probably more foundational than any others, but in terms of changing your approach, this is one of the most difficult. It's the issue of time. Uh, and so the question we ask is, what time is it, or do we even care? And the cultural dimensions there, the attitude toward time can be summarized by punctuality versus relationships or events. So the basic issue here is what decides when you're going to act. Is it the clock or is it people? And this is one of those cultural values that has often caused offense, especially among people who are not so interested in punctuality. Okay, so let's see if we can define these terms just a little bit. When I refer to punctuality, you're probably thinking of a specific minute on the clock. So if I say to you that we have a class that begins at 10:07 in the morning, you're thinking I've got to be in my seat at 10:07 promptly and ready to go. Okay? If not, I will be considered late. But there are some countries in the world where if you said class begins at 10:07, they look at that as a very relative and approximate time. After all, on the way to class, they may meet someone who is important in their lives and take a few moments to talk. And it may cause them to get there at 10:15 or 10:20. But for them, that's not an issue because, after all, people are more important than clocks. That's one way of looking at it. Some would say, yeah, but if you're late for an appointment, then are you not disrespecting the person that you made the appointment with? If I tell a person I'm going to be there at 10 o'clock and I don't arrive until 10:15, have I not wasted that person's time? Is that not a show of disrespect? Well, it could be in some cultures. In other cultures, if I arrive late and I say, hey, sorry, I'm a little late, I was talking to so-and-so, it's not an issue. In fact, in some cultures, you would never even say, I'm sorry I'm late, because you don't consider punctuality that big of a deal. Now, there is more than one way of looking at punctuality. Notice this clock on the left. It says arrive on time. And you can see that the letter A there at the beginning of the word arrive is a considerable distance from the exclamation point after the word time. And what this picture is communicating is that arriving any time within that span from the A to the exclamation point is good. And so, to say that it has to be right when the hour is straight up is not necessarily the way that people would view punctuality. Look at the two clocks on the right. One of them very clearly says 10:08. You can see by looking at that clock that it's giving you a precise time. But the other one, you look at it, you say, what in the world is that one communicating? I have no idea what time it's talking about. And that's because it just isn't a big issue in some cultures as to what time. Now, the fact of the matter is every culture is bound by time. You need to understand that. There is no such thing as a culture where time has no role to play at all. Every culture, God created the world in time and space. And so time is a factor. The question is, how big of a factor is it? And how does time compare to people or events that involve people? Okay? And how elastic can you be when it comes to punctuality. The word punctuality literally comes from the word for point. It's a certain dot on the timeline, okay? But not every culture sees it that way. All right. In some cultures, just to make this even more interesting, if you are planning to meet someone who's very important, and the meeting is scheduled for 10 o'clock, you had better be there by 10 o'clock, but the important person who is going to meet with you may not show up until 10:30 or 11. And that actually communicates the importance of that individual. If that individual were to show up on time or a little early to make sure that he didn't keep you waiting, that would actually diminish his honor and his authority, his status in the relationship. You may have heard about this sort of thing happening in weddings. Here in America, if a wedding is scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when 2 o'clock rolls around, everybody is looking back to see if the wedding party is beginning to march in. Because after all, the wedding was scheduled for 2. And if it's 2:05 or 2:10 before, the seating of the grandparents and the parents begins to take place, people start getting fidgety. But in some countries, in fact, Brazil would be one of them, if the scheduled time for the wedding is 2 o'clock, that may mean that people begin to arrive to decorate at 2 o'clock. It may mean that they're just getting there to begin to analyze the situation and get things organized. The wedding might not start for an hour or two after that. But to them it doesn't matter because it's the occasion and the interaction with people and the wholeness of the event that's important. So I have attended weddings in Brazil where I was very frustrated. Everybody else finally was ready to go, and then, the bride hadn't even shown up yet. And here we are 45 minutes after the hour that was scheduled, and she's not even there. And the first thought that comes to my mind is, well, she's disorganized, or she's disrespectful of her guests, or, something along that line, something very negative. When actually the delay of the bride's coming is intended to excite the crowd with the anticipation of her eventual arrival for the wedding. In fact, if you think about the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ at the rapture of the church to receive his bride, you know that there is a certain uncertainty about his arrival. He says, I go to prepare a place for you and I will come again. But we don't know exactly when it is. And remember the parable of the bridesmaids. They're supposed to have oil in their lamps at all times so that they're ready whenever the bridegroom, in this case it's the bridegroom in that culture, showing up to receive his bride. I'm talking about the bride delaying, but it's the same idea that the delay in the arrival of someone very important is actually intended to create an atmosphere of great anticipation. It heightens the excitement for the one that's going to be coming. So time is a huge factor here, and it's something that I really encourage you to consider. It plays a great role in the way that you relate to people. I know that in Brazil, more than once, I offended people by looking at my watch and saying, I have to go, I have to be somewhere. And they're very polite and say, no problem, I understand. But what they're thinking inside is, why is the clock more important than our relationship? So I'm not saying we throw out the clock. I'm just saying that we need to understand how time is defined and understood and applied in different cultural situations. Okay. Communication is the next one. Speaking of time, I'm looking down here and I see that I'm getting along in this particular segment, so I may have to overlap a little bit. But communication is another very important one. Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, I want you to take a close look at this graphic here because it really does illustrate well the difference in communication in different cultures. Direct communication is a hallmark of the Western world. It's very much uh, a part of the American lifestyle. You hear people say things like, give it to me straight up, okay? Don't beat around the bush, okay? Just spit it out. Those are all ways of communicating the idea of direct communication. Now, why low context? Low context says we don't depend on surroundings or other things to help us communicate the message. We have to say it specifically so that it's understood exactly. In contrast to that is indirect or high context communication. Indirect communication is illustrated on the right-hand side, and where it takes seemingly forever to finally get to the point that you're trying to make about a particular subject. And so, and the reason for that is because in some countries, to speak directly, right to the point, and telling it like it is, actually is considered an affront or an offense to the person. It may cause that person to be ashamed by the way that you come at them so directly. Whereas by working slowly toward what you want to say and being very gracious and kind of getting there little by little, you're actually putting the person at ease and you're not being offensive to them. And so there are times when you might feel that somebody's kind of covering up the truth or trying to be a little deceitful by not giving it to you straight up, when actually what they're doing is they're respecting you by not coming at you directly with something that may be a little bit delicate. If they're dealing with a subject that could potentially be offensive, they're going to be extra careful to be very, very creative in the way that they come to you. Case in point, when Nathan approaches King David, and instead of just coming to King David and saying, you have committed murder and adultery, which he could have done, he came and he told a story about the man who had all the sheep and the other guy that only had one little sheep, and you remember that story. What is Nathaniel doing? He's using indirect communication in order to prepare David gently for what he's going to say. He does get to the point eventually, but he does so in a very respectful, indirect fashion. And so the idea of high context is that you can use a lot of things around you in order to help communicate. For example, I talked about a wedding a few minutes ago. You can step into a church that's getting ready for a wedding, and you know already that it's a wedding because of the decor, the context in there. Everything says wedding, wedding, wedding. And so, a lot of the communication has already been done just by the decorations that are put up in preparation for the ceremony. That's the idea. Whereas direct communication doesn't depend on anything else to communicate. You have to use the specific words that you are needing to communicate the message. So that's what we're talking about. And this is important in cross-cultural ministry because, for instance, if a church discipline matter comes up, an American missionary might want to get right to the point and say, let's figure out what's going on here. Let's talk turkey about this, to use another expression, and let's get to the bottom of this. Whereas people in that culture may say, let's take this slowly and gently. We're dealing with a very sensitive issue here, and let's go carefully. The American missionary might respond by saying, you guys are avoiding the biblical mandate to deal with this. And from their perspective, no, we are not avoiding the issue. We're just treating it in a way that's very delicate and very careful in order to preserve the character and the image of the person as much as we possibly can. All right? So just understand that and don't assume that just because somebody is not dealing directly in their communication that they're trying to hide something, cover up something in some way. That is not the case. And so there are times when the Bible is very direct, and there are other times when the Bible is not so direct, such as in the case of Nathan and David, as we talked about earlier. So, wow, time and communication, two of the big ones. And it's very, very important that we understand how these dynamics work in order to properly relate to people who live in cultures different from our own.